What do you get when you combine a pre-war design, post-war desperation, and British engineering practicality? The Ford Popular 103E, Britain's cheapest new car, and quite possibly one of the most honest automobiles ever built. Picture Britain in 1953. The war had been over for 8 years, yet food rationing still controlled what families could put on their tables. Meat wouldn't come off the ration books until 1954. Bomb sites still scarred London and other cities across the nation. The country was slowly clawing its way back from devastation, and most working families were making do with whatever they could afford. Queen Elizabeth II's coronation in June of that year offered a brief moment of national optimism, a holiday from reality, as the Times called it. But reality was still pretty grim for most people trying to get from one place to another. This was the world the Ford Popular entered. At £390, including taxes, it represented 40 weeks of the average British worker's wages. That's nearly 10 months of labour for 4 wheels, an engine, and not much else. No heater, no passenger side windscreen wiper, not even a water pump. Yet over the next 6 years, Ford would build 155,340 of these Spartan little machines, and they'd become a beloved fixture on British roads. The Popular wasn't just cheap transportation, it represented something more fundamental. It was often the only path to car ownership for working families in an era when buying a decent used car was nearly impossible. The Second World War had halted civilian vehicle production for 6 years, creating a vacuum that wouldn't be filled for years afterward. Export quotas meant that much of what Ford and other British manufacturers did build was shipped overseas to earn desperately needed foreign currency. Even if you could find a new car, government regulations often prevented owners from selling them for up to 3 years after purchase. So here was Ford's answer. Take the old pre-war Anglia design, strip out everything that wasn't absolutely essential, bolt in a reliable engine, and sell it for less than anything else on 4 wheels. Some called it cynical, others called it brilliant. Those who bought one just called it their car. Topic 1. A design with roots going back to 1932. The Ford Popular didn't just borrow from pre-war designs, it was a pre-war design, barely disguised. To understand this car, you need to understand its family tree, because it's more twisted than most. The story begins with the Ford Model Y of 1932, the first car Ford specifically designed for the European market. That Model Y became the 7Y in '37, which was then rebodied and renamed the Anglia E04A in 1939. When production restarted after the war in 1948, that same car became the E494A Anglia. Got all that? Don't worry, even Ford probably needed a chart. When Ford introduced the modern-looking 100E Anglia in 1953, they couldn't just abandon all those old-style body shells and tooling. The solution was pure Ford pragmatism. Keep building the old design, strip out the expensive bits, and market it as the budget alternative. Thus, the Popular 103E was born a 21-year-old design sold as new. The styling was unmistakably pre-war, what enthusiasts affectionately call the sit-up-and-beg design. That upright posture wasn't a fashion choice, it was dictated by the car's transverse leaf spring suspension and tall, narrow body. The Popular retained the pre-war's separate chassis and body construction, at a time when most manufacturers had moved to more modern monocoque designs. Ford's Dagenham plant could stamp these out efficiently because they'd been making them, with minor variations, since before Churchill's first term as Prime Minister. Visually, the Popular was easily distinguished from its Anglia E494E predecessor. Ford fitted smaller headlamps, saving a few shillings per car, and eliminated the trim strips on the bonnet sides. Even the bumpers, which most cars chromed for that touch of glamour, were simply painted to match the body. The fancy bakelite dashboard of the Anglia replaced with a flat steel panel. Early cars had a single centrally mounted tail lamp, though this was later changed to a 2-lamp setup mounted on the rear wings with a separate number plate lamp. Inside, Cost-cutting was evident everywhere. Where the Anglia had offered some creature comforts, the Popular gave you vinyl trim and little else. The floor was made of wood, partly a styling holdover, partly because steel was still somewhat scarce in post-war Britain. That wooden floor would prove to be a maintenance issue years later, but in 1953, it was just another way to keep costs down. Topic 2. Engineering simplicity, or simplicity enforced. Under the bonnet sat Ford's trusty side valve engine, a design that traced its lineage back to Henry Ford's original vision of simple, reliable power. The 1,172 cubic centimeter four-cylinder produced 30 brake horsepower at 4,000 revolutions per minute. In the world of 1950s British economy cars, this was adequate but hardly inspiring. What made this engine notable wasn't its power output, but its fundamental simplicity. The side valve design meant the valves sat beside the cylinders rather than overhead, eliminating the need for complex rocker arms and push rods. This made the engine cheaper to manufacture and easier to maintain, crucial considerations when your customers often couldn't afford professional mechanics. A farmer or tradesman could, with basic tools and some patience, keep this engine running. The cooling system exemplified Ford's penny-pinching approach. Rather than fitting a water pump like most modern cars, the Popular relied on thermosiphon cooling. Hot water naturally rises, cold water naturally falls, and Ford saved the cost of a pump by letting physics do the work. This worked well enough under normal conditions, though it did mean the Popular preferred not to sit idling in traffic on hot summer days. According to a road test conducted by the Motor magazine in 1954, their test car achieved a top speed of 60.3 miles per hour and managed the 0 to 50 miles per hour sprint in 24.1 seconds. Fuel consumption came in at 36.4 miles per imperial gallon. These weren't numbers that would set anyone's pulse racing, but they were honest numbers for honest transportation. The transmission was a 3-speed manual, synchromesh, on second and top gear only. That meant you needed to master the art of double clutching for smooth first to second shifts, or simply accept the crunch. A floor-mounted lever controlled the gearbox, and clutch action was heavy enough to give your left leg a proper workout in city traffic. The braking system used rods and cables to operate drums at all 4 corners, no hydraulics on the 103E. This mechanical setup required regular adjustment and offered the kind of stopping power that encouraged careful forward planning. Synchromesh on only 2 gears, rod-operated brakes, thermosiphon cooling. These weren't features, they were compromises, each one saving a few precious pounds on the sticker price. The electrical system operated on 6 volts rather than the 12 volts becoming standard elsewhere. This meant dimmer lights and slower starter motor operation, particularly on cold mornings. Ford thoughtfully provided a starting handle as standard equipment, which owners in northern England and Scotland learned to appreciate during winter months. Topic 3. What you didn't get for your £390. Let's talk about what the Popular lacked, because the list of missing features was almost as impressive as what it included. No heater. None. In a country where summer is considered any day it doesn't rain, and winter means scraping ice off the inside of your windscreen, Ford decided warmth was optional. Buyers could specify a heater as an extra cost option, but at the Popular's price point, most didn't. They wore extra jumpers instead. No passenger-side windscreen wiper. The Popular came with a single vacuum-operated wiper on the driver's side. Vacuum-operated meant it drew power from engine vacuum, which meant it worked splendidly when you were coasting downhill, but could slow to a crawl or stop entirely when climbing hills or accelerating hard. Owners learned to time their overtaking maneuvers for clear weather. No water pump, as mentioned. No fuel pump either. Gravity fed the carburetor from a tank mounted higher than the engine. No electric windscreen washer if you needed to clear the screen. You stopped, got out, and wiped it with a rag you kept in the car. No radio, naturally. though you could specify one from the dealer if you felt extravagant. The single tail lamp setup on early cars meant following drivers had limited warning of your intentions. Semaphore indicators, those little mechanical arms that popped out from the B-pillars, were fitted, though they were hardly visible in heavy rain or after dark. Boot access required a separate key, a proper coach key as it happened, because an internal release mechanism would have cost extra. The interior featured a bench seat up front trimmed in vinyl that got unbearably hot in summer and painfully cold in winter. There were no seat belts. They wouldn't become standard in British cars for years yet. The dashboard contained only the most essential instruments: speedometer, fuel gauge, and a few warning lights. Oil pressure, water temperature, those were luxuries for people who bought prefects. Yet, here's the remarkable thing, people didn't seem to mind terribly, or rather, they minded but accepted it as the price of ownership. At £390, when the next cheapest alternative, an Austin A30, Morris Minor, or Anglia 100E, cost roughly £100 more, the Popular offered something those cars couldn't: immediate accessibility to the working classes. Topic 4. Why it succeeded: the economics of desperation. The Popular's success wasn't about being a good car, it was about being the only car millions of Britons could afford when they desperately needed one. To understand why 155,000 people chose to buy what was essentially a 1930s design in the 1950s, you need to understand post-war Britain's peculiar automotive economy. The Second World War had stopped civilian car production from 1942 to 1945, 6 years, when no new cars were built for the domestic market. Ford, like other manufacturers, spent those years building military vehicles, aircraft parts, and whatever else the war effort demanded. When peace came, the Labour government faced a nation essentially bankrupt from the cost of victory. Their solution was brutal but logical: export quotas. British manufacturers had to export a significant percentage of their production to earn foreign currency and help rebuild the economy. Through the late 40s and early 50s, getting allocation for a new car as a domestic buyer was genuinely difficult. You might order a car and wait months or even years for delivery. The government even imposed covenants preventing new car buyers from selling their vehicles for up to 3 years, to stop spivs from ordering cars solely to sell them at profit to desperate buyers. This created a bizarre situation where used cars often sold for more than new ones, simply because you could have them immediately rather than joining a waiting list. But there was a problem. There weren't many used cars to buy. The 6-year production gap meant the newest used cars available in 1953 were from 1942 at the earliest, and most were pre-war models from the late 30s. After years of wartime use on poor fuel and minimal maintenance, followed by post-war use under the same conditions, these cars were often worn out. So here was the choice facing a working-class family in 1953. Buy a clapped-out pre-war banger for perhaps £200 to £250, or scrape together £390 for a brand-new Ford Popular that came with a warranty and would actually start on cold mornings. When you put it that way, the Popular's lack of a heater seemed less important. The car's price point was carefully calculated. At 40 weeks' worth of average wages, it was just barely achievable for a working family who could save diligently. Not easy, mind you. 40 weeks' wages represented a significant portion of annual income in an era when most families lived week to week. But it was possible, especially if you'd been saving for several years. Ford also benefited from timing. The Popular launched in 1953, the same year rationing began to ease. Sugar and sweets had just come off the ration, and although meat wouldn't follow until 54, there was a sense that things were finally improving. The coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in June 53 added to this cautious optimism. People wanted to believe in a brighter future, and owning a car, even a Spartan one, felt like progress. Topic 5. Living with a pop, the ownership experience. The people who bought Ford Populars weren't collectors or enthusiasts. They were ordinary working people who needed transportation. So, What was it actually like to own and operate one of these machines? By all accounts, the Popular was reliable in the way simple things tend to be reliable. With so few components to fail, there simply wasn't much that could go wrong. The side valve engine would run for years with basic maintenance, regular oil changes, occasional valve adjustments, and keeping an eye on the cooling system. Many Populars exceeded 100,000 miles without major mechanical work, impressive for any car of that era. The 1,000-mile service intervals Ford advertised were significantly longer than most competitors offered, though the car still needed regular greasing at 13 grease points scattered around the chassis. Early cars had 23 grease points, later ones had 28. Owners learned where these fittings were and kept a grease gun in the boot. The driving experience was, well, basic. The heavy clutch meant your left leg got a workout. The non-synchro first gear required either patient double clutching or acceptance of mechanical grinding. The vacuum wiper's tendency to slow down when you needed it most taught defensive driving. The rod brakes needed firm pressure and forward planning. On the positive side, the lightweight, under 1,600 pounds, meant the Popular felt quite nippy around town, despite its modest power. Winter driving presented particular challenges. Without a heater, the interior stayed essentially at outside temperature. Smart owners kept blankets in the car and dressed for Arctic expeditions. The windscreen would ice up on the inside, and you'd scrape it clear with whatever came to hand: a credit card if you had one, your fingernails if you didn't. The 6-volt electrical system meant the lights were dim by modern standards, and the starter motor could be reluctant in freezing weather. That starting handle wasn't just for emergencies. Some owners used it routinely in winter. The Popular developed a reputation for being easy to work on. The simple engine meant most repairs were within the capabilities of a moderately skilled home mechanic. Parts were cheap and readily available from Ford dealers. This was crucial in an era when professional garage labor represented a significant expense for working families. If you could do your own maintenance, the Popular was genuinely economical to run. Around town, the Popular was perfectly adequate. The 60-mile-per-hour top speed meant motorway cruising wasn't really the car's forte, fortunately. Britain had very few motorways in the early 50s anyway. For the school run, shopping trips, and weekend outings to the countryside, it did exactly what was needed. The fuel economy, while not spectacular, was decent enough to make running costs manageable. Topic 6. The Popular's unexpected second life. As the 50s became the 60s and more modern cars appeared, you might have expected the Popular to simply fade away, ending up as scrap metal. Instead, something unexpected happened. It became Britain's defining hot rod. The lightweight construction that made it economical also made it ideal for modification. The separate chassis meant engine swaps were relatively straightforward. Young enthusiasts, many of them returning from national service with mechanical skills learned in the military, began buying cheap Populars and transforming them into drag racers. The transformation typically involved removing everything unnecessary to save weight. Many were given chopped roofs to lower the profile and reduce drag. The old side valve engine would be replaced with V8 power from American cars, creating machines that bore little resemblance to the sedate family transport Ford had intended. Notable examples included the Church Brothers Gold Rush and Mickey Bray's Pinball Wizard, cars that became icons of British custom culture. Santa Pod Raceway, Britain's first permanent drag strip, saw numerous Popular-based hot rods competing from its opening. The Pop became to British hot rodders what the 32 Ford Model B had been to Americans, the affordable, readily available platform that defined the hobby. This hot rod culture meant many Populars survived that might otherwise have been scrapped. Enthusiasts kept buying them through the 60s and 70s, long after they'd ceased to be viable transport. Even today, the Ford Pop remains a popular choice for British hot rodders seeking an authentic period look. The car also achieved minor celebrity through various media appearances. The BBC extensively modified a Popular to create Bessie, the Doctor's vintage roadster in Doctor Who. Monty Python's Flying Circus featured a black Popular in their Mr. and Mrs. Brian Norris's Ford Popular sketch, a spoof of epic journey films. Between 92 and 97, two black Populars appeared in the TV series Heartbeat as Oscar Blaketon's car. Topic 7. The Popular's eventual replacement. By 1959, even Ford had to admit the Popular 103E had run its course. The design was now 27 years old if you traced it back to the original Model Y, and newer competitors offered significantly more modern engineering for not much more money. The replacement was the Popular 100E, which used the body shell of the previous generation Anglia 100E. This represented a significant step forward. The 100E had a more modern three-box design, hydraulic brakes with 8-inch drums all around, and upgraded to 36 brake horsepower from a strengthened version of the 1,172 cubic centimeter side valve engine. The new Popular was launched at £494 in 1960, equivalent to 26 weeks of average wages. This was actually a lower proportion of wages than the original 103E had been at launch, reflecting both wage growth and improved manufacturing efficiency. It still offered basic transport, still no heater as standard, still austere trim, but it was considerably more modern than what had come before. Production of the 100E Popular continued until 1962, by which time Ford had finally moved to overhead valve engines in their small car range. Between the two Popular models, total production exceeded 280,000 units, cementing the nameplate's role as a staple of post-war British motoring. The Popular name lived on as a base trim level, appearing on the Escort from 1975 and later on the Fiesta, continuing Ford's tradition of offering a stripped-down, affordable option in their range. These later Populars bore little resemblance to the Spartan 103E. However, the 1975 Escort Popular at least came with a heater as standard equipment, a luxury its spiritual ancestor never enjoyed. The Ford Popular 103E wasn't a great car. It wasn't even a particularly good car by the standards of its time. What it was the right car at precisely the right moment, cheap enough for working families to afford, when alternatives were either unavailable or prohibitively expensive. It succeeded because it was honest. Ford made no pretense of offering luxury or advanced engineering. They offered wheels, an engine, and bodywork for £390. You knew exactly what you were getting, and more importantly, what you weren't getting. That transparency appealed to people who'd lived through a war and years of austerity. They didn't need to be sold dreams. They needed transport they could afford. Today, surviving examples of the Popular command modest prices at auction, typically between £3,000 and £6,000, depending on condition. That's both a testament to their status as collectible classics and a reflection that they'll never command the astronomical prices of more glamorous machines. But for those who remember them or whose parents or grandparents owned one, the Ford Pop represents something important: the democratization of motoring in post-war Britain. These little black cars, sitting upright with their pre-war styling and minimal equipment, put thousands of families on the road for the first time. They enabled independence, expanded horizons, and offered a taste of the prosperity that would characterize the later 50s and 60s. The Popular wasn't the car Britain wanted, it was the car Britain needed. Do you remember the Ford Popular? Perhaps your father had one, or you learned to drive in one? Share your memories in the comments below. I'd love to hear your stories about these remarkable little machines. And if you enjoyed this look at an often overlooked piece of British automotive history, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a thumbs up. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.